Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Questions About Music. My name is Fabio Morabito. I'm a musicologist here at the University of Alberta. Questions About Music is the colloquium series of the music department here. And we started this series of conversation in 2022, kind of like after we recovered from the pandemic and trying to think about the things that were good about that allowed us to connect better. And the idea was to have a new reformed colloquium series that allowed us to interact with people in the room, like my wonderful audience sitting in front of me right now, but also with people far away that are connecting from everywhere, really. And we also wanted this series of conversation to be a forum for everyone in the Department of Music, the various different areas, performance, composition, musicology, music theory, popular music and media studies, ethnomusicology, and much more. But we also wanted to make sure that this series was something, a forum for people to converge and talk far beyond these boundaries, all things that have been traditionally understood as disciplinary boundaries or even just administrative boundaries, the way we run music studies at universities, and to be a place for people to way beyond the university to be in conversation with us. And that's why conversation is a bit of a key term in these. We have guests like many other colloquium series, but instead of having them present a formal paper, we interact in a conversation with them and then with the audience members and also with the audience online. So if you have questions at the end, there's about 15 minutes for the people in the room and online to ask questions to our guests. But we really wanted to have, in the way we designed this series, these different voices chime in with each other as part of the way we design. We set this up. It was really very intentionally so. The people that converge with an interest in music and have very different walk of lives. There might be professional performers, there might be music teachers that we invite here and have conversation with, alumni, academics, people that are YouTuber and have thought their profession in very different ways, in a very different way from the way they had, for example, been trained. And we want to ask very different kind of questions that interest us all as people that love music. And loving music is one of our theme today, for sure. But today my guest here is William Cheng, and the reason why I started by saying having various different voices chiming together is because one of the people from whom I learned the value of having that happen is sitting right next to me today. And William Cheng is professor of music and chair of the department at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, not far from Boston. And he's made all the way to us at the U of A to have this conversation, but also to be the keynote of our music graduate conference, which is happening tomorrow. And it's an opportunity for us to get to know a bit better our keynote speaker before hearing a much more in-depth kind of like taste of your research. And so this conversation is to get to know you, to get to know your trajectory, but to introduce you a little bit what the kind of work that Will does. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about how my first encounter with Will, and this was in 2019 at the conference of the American Musicological Society, which in 2019 was in Boston. So you were playing in home, close to home. And I entered for the first time and listened to your paper. And I want to tell you a couple of things that happened to me and that were quite different from other papers that I normally listen to at musicology conference. And I think you should get a sense already about why Will is here today and what the kind of conversation we want to have. And this was a paper that it was the first time that at a musicology conference, the speaker would do a content warning for people that might be triggered by hearing about sexual assault during a paper, and if they had experienced that kind of violence, they would be triggered. And this was the first time that I, as a musicologist, someone that trained in music study for a long time, for decades in fact, that was the first paper that happened to me that someone would do a content warning. And that made me already think like, wow, we don't talk a lot about violence and pain in music studies. We associate music with things that are beautiful and that we love. And you know, the fact that Will started this paper with a content warning of the things made me realize that in a way we're not so comfortable in talking about pain when we talk about music. Another thing that happened in that paper is that Will was connecting very different kind of sources. You were talking about people that have tweeted something, you had blog posts, so not the usual academic sources or peer review kind of scholarship that normally populates these papers as a way of saying like, look, I've done my homework, this is authoritative stuff, authoritative research that I'm presenting. And that made me think a lot about you doing that chiming of different voices, not just saying like, oh, we aim to have all these people in a conversation. No, you were actually presenting that at the utmost musicological conference, one of the most important musicological conferences in the world, in which is all about authority, and we might talk about how do people get to present there. But it's not, since it's so difficult to get there and it's about how authoritative you get, there is a certain etiquette. You might not want to talk about what you've read on the internet, kind of like, things have changed also since 2019, you know, but that inspired me, and it was one of the things that I wanted to have in a conversation like this, have very different voices chime in together, making sure that music studies is not a place for just a certain amount of people, or a group of people that work in a certain way or with certain voices, that vision of the field is something that has inspired, you know, that you were in 2019 putting up for me as a conference attendee. It's something that kept inspiring me in the sort of musicological and music studies spaces that I try to shape. So that's why I wanted to tell you a little bit more about William Cheng, and I wanted Will to be part, to sharing with us his most recent work, but also the very ongoing research that you've been doing. So perhaps since I started with pain, Will, and with the beautiful book that Will was working, and you just published then in 2019, Loving Music Till It Hurts. So maybe we could start about you telling a little bit about the role of pain and hurt in your research, or maybe something to do with your journey. How did you get to write a book about loving music till it hurt?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to visit Edmonton. It's my first time here, although I grew up in Vancouver, and it was great to see the Oilers game on all of the TVs yesterday in every single bar. Thank you. At that AMS paper, I decided to issue a content warning, even though many people debate the efficacy, the ethics of such warnings, in part because I suspected that many people in that room who were trained as musicians and then as musicologists might have experienced, whether they think of it as assault or not, various violences in their musical educations. Music education is, it can be a beautiful thing. It can also be a gauntlet that is incredibly individualizing and isolating and challenging to navigate. And when I was on a fellowship a couple of years ago, in fact, a colleague asked what I was going to work on that year. And at that time, I was working on a different subject than improvisation, which was what I ended up working on. And it was a separate project about violence and sound weaponry. And I remember the colleague said something like, oh, another fun and happy subject, which I think was a way of indicating that a lot of the work that I've done and published has been seemingly been about injustice and violence and pain and all of those kind of darker themes. And it really got me thinking that, oh yeah, I feel like I've been writing a lot about negation and negativity and conflict. And I don't think it's because those subjects necessarily cried out to me as things that I naturally would have been drawn to, but it's because I just saw a lot of silences in the field around many of these subjects. So the Boston AMS paper that Fabio was mentioning, I believe in that paper I talked about the conductor James Levine and the decades of kind of abuse that was covered up by many institutions, such as the Met. And one question that came up in the paper, and that comes up a lot in our classrooms, in popular discourse, is separating art from artist. In the paper, I played one of Levine's, I think Brahms recordings, third movement,
Symphony number 3.
third symphony, yeah, and I noted that, oh, I love that recording, actually. It's one of my favorite recordings of Brahms's Third Symphony, and does that make me a bad person, or does it mean that I have somehow, in my mind, been able to disaggregate, Levine the person, Levine the musician? I think our susceptibility to music, our vulnerability to its allure, its enchantment, can teach us a lot about our general vulnerabilities in everyday life, to people, to objects that we feel attached to ideals, ideas, ideologies, and to certain habits and social formations that become normalized simply through our acquiescence to them on a mundane basis. I continue to teach the music of quote unquote, problematic or canceled musicians in some of my courses, precisely because I want students to recognize that, their vulnerability to musical enchantment is not much different structurally from vulnerabilities to, let's say, abusive partners or to really toxic ideals. And I think we'll talk more about just how. Go ahead.
No. I think this is so important, and I love when questions about music becomes also something that people that are in the professions and studying. There are undergraduate students, graduate students. So, and I get plenty of questions from people like, "What should we do with Wagner or with problematic people that certainly did harm?" And so I love the fact that it's like, no, I'm keep teaching them. I want people to know about this music and how we can be susceptible to it, notwithstanding the issues. But I also, one of the things that fascinated me the most about your book, Loving Music Till It Hurt, is how your own personal journey with pain became almost a way of thinking, I don't want to say methodologically, but kind of like certainly as a way out of the music and then back, in an almost reframed way. Would you like to share with us a little bit more about your journey with the kind of like brought you to, those silences, of course, were very much part in the field, but I was wondering, and I'm with you, like, it's not a very appealing topic to write a whole book or several research projects, pain, injustice, but and the fact that it was important to do at that point in the field. I also wanna hear about the reception to that kind of. Did people feel that you were bringing kind of like the dark tones, or that you were or that perhaps that you were ruining some of their enchantment, or their love for music was threatened by talking about this topic? So maybe we can perhaps talk about this first, and then more about your journey.
Yeah, I don't. In Loving Music Till It Hurts, I'm pretty transparent about my own culpability in terms of being kind of subjected to lots of mystiques and myths about music. I say that I'm completely I'm not always, even when I'm trying to critique the idea, for example, that loving music makes us better people or loving Beethoven makes us edified. I continually grapple with my own susceptibility, and I think that's one step, which is to recognize that it's not me, the academic, who has mastered this discourse, who's telling other people how they must approach music, but rather I'm part of this community, and I think we all understand what it's like to be kind of bewitched or beguiled by really powerful aesthetic objects. In Loving Music Till It Hurts, I point out that sometimes we love music so much that it almost hurts, like we become short of breath, our heart rate increases might feel a tightness in our body, because it's wonderful to be able to access those affective moments. We might also love music so much that we think music itself, we anthropomorphize it. We think of music itself as something that is susceptible to pain. Like we might take offense on behalf of the Beethoven sonata when a performer, quote unquote, butchers it or doesn't do injustice to it, or think of any other kind of metaphor or analogy that uses imagery of physical or metaphysical violence. And lastly, we can love music so much that we end up hurting other people because perhaps we choose to defend a credibly accused of sexual assault conductor rather than think about what the victim's needs are and what justice, restorative and otherwise, might look like. I started thinking a lot about loving music and ways back to loving music, in part because in the kind of 2010s, over several years, and I experienced chronic neuropathic pain. I wrote about this in a very short book, and it was a personal book. It felt strange to write at the time. It was a book that dealt with how we sometimes seemingly create these artificial divisions between our professional and personal personas. This idea that you go to work, you do your research, and you keep your private feelings, your private vulnerabilities out of it because no one wants to hear about that latter stuff. It's irrelevant to the research that you put out, and that's just not the way that the world actually works, because as we go through everyday life, we our bodies kind of anything can happen, right? So this idea that we need to always allow ourselves to be kind of fully able-bodied and always productive for some larger cause, for the academy, it's disingenuous, and it can do real harm in terms of not recognizing all of the accommodations that might be needed in order to allow everyone to flourish as they like to.
Yeah. We're talking about injury as something that it's there for every musicians,
Yeah.
Sort of like.
And
as
my pain prevented me from, the chronic pain prevented me from doing research because it was really quite debilitating. I couldn't play piano for a while, and so I kind of felt in those years that music, this companion that I had all my life, just kind of went away, and whatever romantic notions I had that music might be a source of solace or even pain relief or purpose, it really left me, and I felt abandoned by this thing that I knew was not a person or a living entity, and yet felt very close to me, almost as if it were a partner or a soulmate even. And so I felt a bit betrayed by music, even though I know, music
you broke
didn't.
up.
Yeah,
we kind of broke.
Yeah, it was a
rocky one.
It was kind of a mutual breakup. I don't know, but I know that it wasn't. It was rather that certain circumstances created that outcome. So I've thought a lot subsequent to that, how one falls out of love with music during their life and career, how they might find ways back to loving music, and what we even mean when we say things like we're trying to find ways back to loving. Oftentimes we conflate, I think, our love or passion for something with our proficiency in that craft. And growing up, learning classical piano, I don't think I always practiced piano thinking, I love this, and especially when I was performing. I had terrible stage fright. I didn't go on stage and think, I'm loving this right now. If anything, it was like, please don't let anything terrible happen. I can't wait for this to be over. And I think I thought I loved music growing up because I practiced at it and tried to be good at it, but that's not the same thing as affection, right? So.
And these things about that you're talking about in terms of confusing the proficiency with love, I think is such a fascinating aspect to consider, especially if we consider the way, and I love that, our department is also a place where performers grow and build careers and relationship with music. And it's interesting how much excellence and proficiency is foregrounded as something that is almost at times taken for granted as what being in a music studies place is about, getting to that higher level of proficiency. But at the same time, I love that you say, like, I felt betrayed by music, almost as if on one side, this focus on personal achievement, it's there and it can work up to a point, but then there is also something to do with what if instead of just personal achievement and being better than the average, or being extremely virtuosic on the piano and being able to not have stage fright and just kind of like get on there and treat everyone to a spectacular performance. But how about the community? At what cost are we doing the spectacular performance, and how the people are falling, are breaking up with music because of that? So I think that's a very important question to ask. At what cost?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the norms of perfectionism and excellence in, let's just say, classical music today, these are cultural, social constructions of the 20th century, with the professionalization of musical performance, with the proliferation of competitions, with the recording industry that then puts out material examples of really perfected performances that might have been edited in all sorts of ways. We have such unrealistic standards about perfection in classical music, the same way we have unrealistic beauty standards about pretty much everything. And those standards, again, are constructed, and they serve certain communities better than they serve others. There are people whose bodies do not necessarily conform to the types of instruments that are available. There are people who might have tendencies to play in styles that are not normative and celebrated and embraced. And if we can perhaps pivot to the American Musicological Society, the academic side, individualization in academics is as pronounced as individualization in performance. This idea that as a scholar, especially in the humanities, because in the sciences there's a lot of co-authorship, as a scholar in the humanities, you do your research, you find your focus, your niche, you produce great peer-reviewed publications.
You become an expert
You become an expert, and you own that expertise, and that is you as your person, you as your kind of academic persona. And with the American Musicological Society and many other academic conferences, the way that a program is created is there's a committee, they read oftentimes abstracts, like short summaries of people's proposed papers, they select them based on quote unquote merit, and then you form this pretty exclusive set. AMS's acceptance rate, I think, is 25%. And I've said in past kind of conversations that is certainly one way to create a program, but the other way is to, let's just say, all AMS dues paying members, graduate students, faculty, everyone gets to present at AMS once every 3 years or 4 years. Let's say 4 years, because 20% acceptance rate.
Which means everyone would have the chance to do so.
Yeah, which means everyone who wants to present their research, their dissertation research, their master's thesis, their current research on as a faculty member, everyone gets to share their work, and everyone therefore gets to hear work that might never have had the platform at a national conference. That's the other way, which is more communal focused, and which is, I think, more truly an embodiment of what intellectual pursuit is, which is not a culling of pursuit based on very short summaries of what those pursuits by a very small and arbitrary community committee of experts, but rather this recognition that we're all in it together, and all of our knowledge pursuits are equally valuable, and that if only we could have that opportunity to just share everyone's work and engage in everyone's work, that will actually give us a full sense of where the field is, which is, you know, these questions that are often asked, like, where's the field going? Where's the field going? Well, it's usually not going anywhere very quickly because we're only ever seeing
certain
a very narrow band of research.
Yeah.
And what a shame that that all of those papers that can't be accepted every year just don't make it to the light of day at that conference.
Ah. And some people walk away also, you know, if they don't get accepted
Oh,
here, there, and there,
absolutely.
they fall apart from, you know, they break up.
Yep.
With
And what are the kinds of research that tend to be sidelined, marginalized, versus the kinds of research that get centered? What kinds of norms in language? You know, the art of writing an abstract is very precise, right? You have 200 words to say what you want. And yeah, there are so many problems with how we evaluate what is a good abstract versus an inadequate abstract. Yeah, so.
No, but it's interesting, and in a way, I love how your work connects the academic environment and the way in which people get career in the academic environment, also in the way people get career in the music professional, classical music, Euro-colonial classical music work. And so, in a way, it highlights some of the way in which merit and value it's created and recreated and re-established. And so, sort of like, there's this kind of filiation in sort of like reproducing. There is a reproducibility of certain things and erasures of others. But you know, it's interesting how, if we think about the practice of music making across centuries and millennia, like that's in a way improvisation and things that are less restricted to conforming and playing exactly those notes is much more prominent if we think about the Western music culture, but also many other cultures, like in a way that is far less restrained and restricted. So this could be a moment to pivot perhaps to some of the way of that you've seen ways towards loving music back in a different ways. That, of course, one is suggesting that AMS does it differently, of course, and ways in which we can also change curriculum in our universities to make sure that we don't confuse proficiency and love, and that kind of awareness for sure. But you know, your newest project is on improvisation, so I was wondering if you could tell us how you got into improvisation as something that, as a way back of loving music.
Sure, yeah. I think I've been encouraged to improvise ever since I was a kid by my first piano teacher, Ellen, and she was an organist as well as a pianist, and she really encouraged me to learn things by ear. It wasn't till decades later that I really recognized, because as a 6-year-old, I had no idea that organists have a rich history of improvisation. I just thought my teacher liked me to be able to pick up like the Simpsons theme or the MASH theme. She'd play something and say repeat after me, and I'd do the best I could. I really am grateful for that kind of upbringing. I also grew up playing, I've been playing video games for as long as I've had memories, I think. And the handshake deal with my mom was always, 1 hour of piano practice and you get to play an hour of video games. And again, this is decades later, but looking back, I think I perceived this disconnect between the sense of freedom and agency I had in video games, like being able to make Mario jump or hop over the Goomba versus stomp on the Goomba. But when you're practicing a Bach invention, and performing it, you're not supposed to change any notes. It's kind of more like a video game on the rails. And also, when you're executing any classical piece, you're supposed to do what in video game lingo would be called a no-hit or no damage run, basically a virtuosic playthrough of a level or a boss run where somehow you avoid all of the attacks and you take no damage to your health, which is very impressive. But that's kind of what classical music demands, which is perfection. Again, it wasn't until more recently that I started researching the long history of improvisation, not just in classical music, but other musics. And it's super weird that classical music is one of the few kinds of music today that kind of continues to reject improvisation, whereas pretty much every other kind of musical tradition I can think of at least still embraces improvisation. Nowadays, if a classical music kid were to ask their teacher or to express to their teacher, oh, I'm kind of interested in improv, that teacher most likely would say, oh, you should probably, we can start you on jazz lessons also, which kind of, which misses the point. It's also an insidious trope that, as writers such as Vijay Iyer have written about, that classical music is the non-improv one in the room, because that means that the improvisers, the propagators of unstable or unruly or unstructured or unnotated musics are the black and brown and indigenous people of the world, right? But classical music has been perfected. The repertoire is every note is pristine and the engraving is set, so don't deviate. That's a very strange message, I think, to send, because it wasn't till the 20th century that improvisation started really waning in European classical art music. Prior centuries, it was a lively, flourishing practice. In fact, it wasn't distinguishable from everyday musical practice. Improvisation was continuous and contiguous with learning repertoire. It was just a matter of coursework. You didn't have to separate it out. And today it's very different. Yeah,
the improviser and the composer and the performer were sometimes all inhabiting the same body.
Yeah. And speaking of pain and the body, one thing I've learned to think a lot about as I've tried to revive an improvisatory practice is how I try to prioritize making music or improvising in a way that feels good to my hands, to my body, where I can feel like I'm not trying to play things in ways that might be normalized in, let's say, certain repertoire, but doesn't feel natural to me. So today I still will occasionally play through some repertoire, and when I play through certain repertoire, I realize that my hands will feel, if not outright injured, will certainly feel uncomfortable sometimes, because there are passages in like Rachmaninoff and Brahms where your wrist twists in weird ways. I've learned that when I improvise, I don't twist my hands unnecessarily in weird ways. I'll play it in the most kind way possible to myself,
to your body,
while still pushing my hands at every moment to try to do new things. And I think we don't talk much about how to make music in ways that honor and respect our own bodies, because we have all of these goalposts and metrics of excellence from repertorial execution that we're meant to live up to. You don't have time to think about whether your body feels good while playing Mozart. You're supposed to just play Mozart. But that means we're not thinking about performers as vulnerable human beings who are always susceptible to injury, to disability, debility.
very different bodies also. You know, we were discussing earlier how much the piano, it's an instrument that in a way, because of the standardization of those measurements, you know, it means that if you have a smaller hand, it's not that you can get a smaller double bass or a smaller violin. You know, not that it really does, it's really a possibility also for those instruments, but at least you can bring your own instrument to play, right? Whereas piano, normally you get to a place and you have to adapt to what's there. So your body needs to fit something, you know, and then your merit is evaluated on the basis of how good you fit. But that doesn't quite account for the variety of body. You know, I want to hear from the piano players in the room later. But
there are pianos that have not taken off in part because of, so there are pianos designed with narrower keys, so the whole piano is a little narrower. But you can imagine why these pianos have not become adopted widely. It's because, well, expense, but also just lack of enthusiasm for greater inclusion, including people with smaller hands, with one hand. And Blake Howe, the musicologist, has an article in Journal of Musicology about Paul Wittgenstein, who played piano, lost an arm in a war, and then played a lot of left-hand repertoire. And Blake notes, or asks the question that about, well, would piano competitions ever allow pianists to bring their own instrument to compete on? And it seems almost unimaginable, even though, you know, violinists and other instrumentalists get to, and vocalists get to bring their own voice. But somehow this normative, like 88 key piano that's that size, we don't think about touching, and it's a very, it's a strange thing.
Yeah, thinking about touching, since we don't think about touching the piano. Another thing that we don't think to touch is pitch. You know, I remember reading you writing about your experience of someone studying piano, that there was very little room, let's say in a piano to invention piece by J.S. Bach, there was very little room. Like there was certainly room for you in this tradition as an interpreter to dynamics, expressions, and changes of articulation perhaps, but pitch is something that, so I guess the title of your new project, Touching Pitch, sounds a little bit to me answering the call of doing exactly what would not be so much allowed, like changing the notes, in other words. And it reminds me also of a book that by Roger Parker that is called Remaking the Song from 2006, that he, as much as he was talking about how much Freghi theater changed the way we watch opera today, so that you might have the libretto of an opera set in the 18th century, but what you see on the stage is an ultra-modern performance, so a very different adaptation of what's happening, of the staging of an opera, but people would still not touch the notes of Mozart, for example. And so he would, Roger provocatively in 2006 would say, like, I am advocating for us to change the music, the melodies, the notes, Mozart notes. So when I heard the title of your project, Touching Pitch, that's how I. Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm fascinated by pianists or any musician who might claim that they can't change notes or can't envision how notes could change. And especially by musicians who say they can't improvise. Many famous musicians, let's just say pianists, have said categorically, I can't improvise. Leon Fleischer, in conversation with Anne Midgett, who co-authored his biography, he said at one point in that biography, if there's one thing I really wish I could do or could have done, it's to improvise. Immediately after that, he says, I think it's colon, to improvise colon, to play real jazz. And he says, but I can't because I feel so beholden to the notes, and it almost feels like my hands are locked into the notes on the page. Martha Argerich has also said she can't improvise, and she's told this to Gabriela Montero, who's one of the most prolific classical improvisers these days. And Montero said to Argerich, I don't believe you. because we have to think about what we mean by improvisation. It's not just inventing out of whole cloth like a 20-minute fantasy with no recognizable themes. It's improvisation is, as Dan DiPiero would say, is living. Living is contingency. We're constantly making micro decisions. So when a choir starts singing slightly out of tune and every member makes those micro calculations to get slightly back in tune, that's improvisation. When a musician has a memory slip on stage and wants to cover it up so that the audience doesn't think there's something terrible happening, they also very kind of instinctually and proficiently will course correct and run damage control. All of that is improvisation, and it's strange that we don't credit ourselves with being more capable of improvising. My sense is that anyone who plays music is not only capable of improvising, but always already improvising more than they think they are. And yeah, I suspect that the people who can perhaps most proficiently improvise, at least from a kind of technical standpoint, are the people who are most fearful of it, which means we have this biased, because there are incentives to not improvise and to perfect repertoire.
Right.
If you're in a conservatory and you want to win competitions, so the incentives aren't lining up, and it's both by design and both kind of a byproduct of just how our institutions have been set up to reward certain types of performance over others.
And I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the keynote tomorrow, but I have listened to a video of you playing the Clair de Lune sonata by Beethoven, that you changed the notes quite a bit. And I was
the Moonlight Sonata.
Sorry,
sorry.
The Moonlight Sonata. And so you start quite in a familiar way, and then you move to very kind of like, and I could imagine almost now that you were saying that you will listen to your hands and push them to do things that you had not thought about it before. But I was thinking, how do you imagine that? What response have you had so far of that kind of performances? What kind of because one thing is talking about improvisation in that way, but would that happen in a typical concert environment? What is even typical concert environment today? Like, how do you imagine that to happen? And do you want more people to do that kind of starting the Moonlight Sonata in the familiar way and then ending in a very different manner? Like, I was wondering about that.
Yeah. So I definitely am not prescribing any particular type of performance modality. I would only encourage musicians in general to think about their imaginations as they're playing anything. So as a kid, I remember even learning the Moonlight Sonata, just thinking about all the different ways it could go in the middle of the sonata.
Yeah.
Not that I don't think as a kid attempted anything, but I was always like, yeah, this could go here. Because at the same time I was reading a lot of like Choose Your Own Adventures, Goosebumps books that especially had that. And it's so much fun to make choices. It's also so much fun to be inspired so much by a piece of music that you love that you want to make more versions of it. We also have to recognize that many composers that are canonized today, also those who aren't canonized, many of them were such perfectionists in a way that they had so many doubts about their own music. And this brings to mind, like, Sergei Rachmaninoff, there was a disastrous premiere of his first symphony. The consensus is it wasn't like conducted and performed well, but Rachmaninoff has these searing reflections where he says, he basically goes back and forth. He says, do I love Symphony Number 1, his own Symphony Number 1, because I wrote it and I'm just partial to it, as composers tend to be partial to their own works? or do I actually think it's a good composition? And he just goes back and forth, and he ends that reflection by saying, maybe one day I'll grow tired of it and I'll rip it up. Rachmaninoff was full of doubt about the music he published, not to even mention the music he didn't publish, which makes us realize that how a composer ultimately published their work lives right alongside all of the other parallel realities where they could have made different choices. It's not like Rachmaninoff had this, divine inspiration and then he channeled everything and that's exactly the way it was. Artists are full of doubt, and doubt is not antithetical to improvisation. Doubt is just, or to creativity, I should say. Doubt and creativity are co-authors. You need doubt to create, and when you create, you're constantly in doubt, because if you weren't, I don't even think it would be called creativity. It would just be a kind of recitation.
Or transfer.
Or transfer, yeah.
Fascinating. Doubt and creativity are co-authors. I think it's a beautiful moment to open to the floor for question for Will, to anything that we've discussed, but also for people that know Will work more broadly. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to ask questions. Question from the audience.
Yeah, and feel free to ask me anything. I'm happy to. Nothing's off the table. So
go ahead.
So I'm thinking a bit about perfectionism and also kind of this idea. So I'm taking this music and philosophy course at the University of Toronto with Sherry League, and we talked a lot about how musicologists are often ashamed to talk about beauty in music or admit that we even enjoy music.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I'm detecting echoes of Yankelevich in some of what you said. We were talking about enchantment. And I'm thinking how Yankelevich talks a lot about enchantment, but also bewitchment. And almost he's you can allow yourself to be, I guess, enchanted by music to an extent, but not too much. And I think it kind of comes out of this, not wanting to admit too much to enjoying music, or trying to, I guess, keep things in moderation and focus more on, technical perfection. The other thinker I'm thinking of is Bart, where he looks at, in the grain of the voice, where he's looking at, Fischer Dieskau as, this embodiment of, the technical perfection, that, optimized voice. And there's at Panzerei, where he actually, what he likes about Panzerei is the imperfections in his singing, the individuality that makes it unique. And I'm just thinking I'm wondering if some of the issues you're identifying in classical music culture that are, I guess, struggling to adhere to this, unattainable perfectionistic standard is coming out of this, I guess, unwillingness to talk about joy or beauty in music, because it somehow comes across as being unserious in academia.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just beauty, but love tends to be sidelined. Or rather, the way I sometimes put it is we tend to sublimate our love through certain academic and intellectual exercises with our objects of study, such that the love is not spoken, but it's manifested in your labor. So a music theorist might, in an article, never say, "Oh, I love this Haydn sonata," but they will spend 20 pages analyzing every little detail. That's a kind of doting, right? We dote on things that we love, how I can't help but snuggle my cat every day, even though he seems annoyed by it. But that doting is affection, and it's attachment, and it's basically love. But as you say, if we articulate that love, suddenly that word, that elephant, is on the table, and it becomes an embarrassment, or it becomes a different kind of conversation, or it becomes unscholarly. It's very odd that the very thing that drives us to become, let's say, music scholars, musicians, which is our affection for the art, ends up being completely kind of passed over, almost as if, almost like, you know, you have a good friend when you're young, and then you grow up and you grow apart and grow differently, and then you become embarrassed to be associated with that.
It's almost as if pre-critical, you know, love is pre-critical before you got your tools, your academic tools to analyze. But that's of course not the case. There's not different moments.
Yeah, all of us came to music by being somehow allured by its beauty or whatever, its mystiques, and but then we grow up and then we put that as in a box. There's great work more recently about these precise issues. Rita Felsky, the literary scholar, co-edited a volume called Love, Etc. I think it came out last year, and in the volume they talk precisely about the subjugation of love in academic discourse.
And Rita Felsky has done incredible work about art and attachment, attunement, so it's fascinating.
And the limitations of critical critiques.
The limits of critiques, yeah. Other questions for Will? Go for it, yes, please.
I'm struggling to articulate this, but I'm wondering to what extent you think that idea of this rejection of love and ideas of passion in academia is related potentially to the perception of gender and gender roles in academia. The way you talk about how you want to express, or there's this want to express love and passion towards a thing, but there's this rejection to it. It reminds me a lot of like being socialized as a male and growing up like that, where you're not really allowed to show a lot of affection to your friends. There's this need to maintain distance. It reminded me of that in a lot of ways, and I almost wonder if, especially in a more misogynist academia, if there's this need in order to be perceived as intelligent to also be perceived as male or masculine. And part of that perception, I wonder if it relies on this need to feel distanced or emotionally cold.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think you're absolutely right. And that goes alongside the other factors in the professionalization of musicology and music studies in the 20th century. When musicology became like a thing in the 20th century, its pioneers were largely white and male, of course, and they also needed to do a few things. They needed to distance musicology from performance certainly, but also the musical discourses of the past centuries, right? When you read critics and biographers and who wrote about classical music in the 19th century, 18th century, their discourse is full of unserious opinions about the music. Like, they will be very forthcoming about how much they love or hate certain works, and they're pretty firm about those things. Musicologists needed to distinguish themselves by saying, oh no, we're not music critics, we're actually scholars. They also turned to scientism as a way to justify the creation of that field. So there's a lot of scientistic envy, meaning we need to look at materials, we need to look at manuscripts and write objective histories and proofs basically. And so all of that disavowal and insecurity created these norms where writing directly about passion and love and attachment were not just anathema to the ethos of the field, but also strategically inopportune, because you don't want to be associated with a dilettante. You want to be the expert. And that's one thing that I mentioned in loving music, which is, you know, I don't think I've called myself a music lover all my life, even though I'm sure I am. Because when we say music lover these days, we think of amateurs, right? And we think of fans. And that's such an elitist kind of trope. Like, we're all music lovers as music scholars and as performers, but we pretend like there's this separate category of people who merely love music and cannot speak as deeply and profoundly and authoritatively as we can. And Professor Patrick Nicholson here co-authored an article with Dylan Robinson, Ways of Knowing Music, and I really loved that article because it pointed up all of the ways that we distinguish between people who are suited to talk about music and people who aren't. And what an arbitrary division that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that must have been a moment in the history of the discipline that they tried to say, like, we need to distinguish ourselves from those who merely love music. But I am hoping for a discipline of music studies in which we can all be music lovers and contribute and be part of a conversation about music. That's why I called it Questions About Music. Other questions? I saw another hand earlier. Alison, did you want to ask something?
I don't know how to. It was kind of a thought. It's not so much a question, but talking about improvisation and reading notated music, and I'm wondering, like, I find I do a lot of improvising, and then I also play a lot of composed music and a lot of like newly composed music, and I find a great value in what improvising, how it enhances my ability to interpret written music, for like really practical reasons, such as like, I don't know, not every composer is as specific as, they're more or less specific in what they put on the page, and so I can bring a kind of intuition to kind of like fill in the gaps of what's on the page, or composers are more or less like skilled at literally writing what they want on the page, and so I can kind of use those abilities that way. And it's more of a remark. Maybe we ought to. Maybe it's just sort of, I can see the value for sure in what the two bring each other. I feel, and like also in terms of like your body, at one's body when they perform, there being maybe shortcomings to achieve what you think ought to be the way you play whatever sonata or concerto or something, but maybe through improvisation, and like you were saying, how you play more optimized and dialed into your body's ability, you could bring that more like optimizing playability to whatever composed piece. Maybe there might be a way to like blend the two. If you know how to play super kindly to your body when you're improvising, if only, and maybe there is, you could access that in composed music too. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of changing notes. Well, certainly, I'm happy to change lots of notes, basically, like create a fantasy out of the moonlight, but also changing like a few notes here and there, because no one's ever going to hear it in the audience, and also you can just be nice to yourself and probably play it much more smoothly than if you were trying to nail every single note, as if every note
has the spirit of the composer.
And missing one note means
not playing that piece.
Means you did not play that piece because you missed. Yeah, and there are philosophers of music and aesthetics who will debate whether or not you've actually played the Moonlight Sonata if you missed a note in the Moonlight Sonata. And that's weird because if someone stumbles during like a Shakespeare play and then they correct themselves, you're not going to say, I didn't see a Shakespeare play tonight. But we so idealize certain like repertoire that and canons that it's anathema to not execute it exactly as written. So.
Yeah. There was Victoria and then Scott.
Well, yeah, just to add what Alison said about improvisation, how it could translate to written out music, and to your comment, how improvisation helped you to deal with pain and to be able to play again pain-free. And I think I just like the idea, because if you improvise, you just automatically listen to your body. You do what you enjoy at that moment, right? And we don't have that idea so much. We are stuck to a score when we perform other music. But I think we should feel as free as we improvise when we play written out music. And I think this is what we should also teach our students. So I'm not quite convinced that written out music is brings tension. It can be, but with right technique and right approach, it should be as improvised, ideally. It often doesn't happen, of course, there's a limit. And but I like how it helped you to deal with pain, because I myself feel when I play written out music that it creates pain to me as well, not so much physically but emotionally, because of the elements you mentioned, the conventions, perfectionism, this is the training, this is our culture, right? And so I feel kind of, I can relate to what you say on an emotional level. As a pianist myself, play mostly classical music. I'm tending now more and more to play more avant-garde music because I feel it brings me more joy, and I don't feel so much pain. I don't know where this is leading now, but I just see where I can relate to that, and I see it that there can be a translation of conversation to classical music, to culture, to what we are experiencing right now, and maybe we should just kind of think beyond kind of conventions. And I think the classical field is also changing. The concert setting is changing. The performance of musicians is changing. So we are kind of maybe moving a little bit more into a new culture or new ideas where we can be free.
Or a kinder place. I love what you're saying, Victoria. We're moving to be kinder.
Yeah, and I think just by talking from experience, it's very, especially if you do it for a long time, you need to feel the freedom, even if you play music as it's so demanding and so restricted in many ways. At the same time, not losing the perfectionism. So it's I wanted to say I can very much relate to what you said.
Yeah, thanks.
Scott?
Yeah, this is an echo chamber now. I'm just vamping off of these two comments. I started out as a pianist when I was very young, and I'm not going to go into my story. I wanted to give you an interesting analogy that I heard once from a friend of mine named Liz Toney, who's a pianist from Boston, also just an amazing improviser on the voice and piano. And I had met her many, many years ago, and we were having a conversation about piano lessons because her main way that she made her living was teaching very young children how to play the piano. And she told me a really interesting story. She said, what I used to do when I taught piano to young kids is the very first lesson, I wouldn't teach them any technique at all. I wouldn't show them any repertory. I wouldn't do anything. I just let them play. And she said it was the most amazing experience to see what these kids would do. And she said the problem with it was that, first of all, the parents didn't like it. And the second thing is, of course, in the next lesson, or the lesson in which the rules came, all of that creativity went out the window. The kids themselves were instantly not interested in the creativity anymore because they wanted to do it right. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is it makes me think, so just this whole conversation about the genreification of music and the huge amounts of different kinds of music that exist today. And as a professor of music, I'm constantly wondering, like, am I doing the right thing? How do we approach teaching music to kids who are coming through school and what their only experiences are with music are these large ensembles that continue to sort of bring the tradition of Western classical music into the world. I have a friend, for example, in town whose kid was really interested in music, but the only way that he could experience music in school was through band, and he hated it. It was completely not where his head was at and where his actual culture was at either. And so I guess I'm going to try to turn this into a question that has to do with our role as teachers in the university, where it's clear that we need to make room for new ways of making music, new voices, actually even just old ways of making music. But all of this actually has to be done before college, right? As kids are coming in, we have to hope that those kids have had enriching experiences. I'm looking at Adele. I know this is a real passion of yours. And so I'm just wondering, as a professor, as a teacher of music, have you thought about ways that we could really radically change the way that we actually introduce music to kids? Maybe kind of removing this professionalization component, which really comes from industry. I mean, that's why we have Berklee College of Music is where you go if you want to be in popular music, and you're going to go to a conservatory if you want to be in classical music. But actually, when you're a kid, you don't know what kind of music you want. You play video games. I do too. Like those video games, those simple melodies, sometimes the nostalgic element that they bring in are so profound, and we have to acknowledge the value of that music for kids today, I think. And so it's a big question, but I'm just wondering if you've had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree that earlier, like K through 12 development is so important, and different schools and parents have different resources, and so it's very difficult to innovate in a kind of global sense. Some of what you said reminded me of the many systematized music pedagogy methods that really think of kids as these vessels that are primed to move and to think about, to create rhythms with their bodies and to experiment. And we kind of idealize the innocent child in that sense and wish nostalgically that could that kind of wide, bright-eyedness could persist later in life. I actually don't think that college is too late to course correct and it might actually be the right moment to catch many students, even those, and maybe especially those who have been in the much more systematized norms that we're familiar with. And one way, we don't have to go deep into this, but one way would be through curricular reform. At Dartmouth, 5 years ago or so, the music department decided to do something that none of the other departments were doing and none, I don't think any department has done since. We held lots of listening sessions with current students, alums, and with faculty, staff. We then kind of had a long retreat where we discussed our requirements for the music major, and we ended up removing all prereqs and all requirements, and we went to an individualized faculty-student advising model where the student and the faculty come up with a slate of courses that make sense for the student's needs and aims, because not all students need the same courses and not all of them are interested in the same courses. And we did this for several reasons, but among the most prominent was that we did not want discrepancies in past privilege, access to music lessons, for example, classical music lessons or bands, to be a factor in whether a student feels like they're already behind or not when they enter a music department. Because it's not a great feeling for a student to feel like, oh, there's all of these prereqs that my peers have had because they grew up wealthy and had access, and I need to catch up before I can even be a real music major. That makes no sense, because our music major has enough of a robust curriculum that students can pick up all the skills they need, or so we hope, along their journey. I think we can make such changes without thinking that we're compromising excellence. I also like I find it curious that one of the lines that we often hear, or when I share with colleagues at other schools that our department has done this, they might ask, well, so can your student, can a music major at Dartmouth graduate with a music major without ever having heard a Mahler symphony? And my thought is,
Please.
like, what? There are physicists who graduate with a physics major who never learn certain principles of physics. Why is Mahler like so? And I'm not saying everyone always says Mahler as the example, but people catastrophize. They they think, oh, how embarrassing would it be if a school had music majors coming out of it who didn't know X, Y, Z, as if we have a totalizing concept of things that are need to know.
Or what music
and-
is.
Yeah, exactly. There are music majors who graduate all over the world who have not listened to Björk. But that doesn't mean we suddenly need to make that a requirement.
Yeah.
It's kind of disingenuous to ask those what if questions because it derails the conversation about more generous accessibility and accommodation.
Yeah. You have no idea, Will, how topical this is. We'll bring you out for dinner and want to hear more about what you did at Dartmouth about curriculum review. But in the meantime, I think this is a great moment to thank Will one more time. Thank you. And please stay with us for a glass of wine and snacks.